No one wanted to marry her. Then her pottery changed everything. They called her cursed. They mocked her silence. But when her hands shaped the future in clay, the entire village fell to their knees. Now the fate of the chief's son, and the village itself, rests in the hands of the woman they once rejected. Will they realize her worth before it's too late? The sun hung low over the village of Mji wa Udongo, casting golden streaks across the red earth. A warm breeze carried the scent of wet clay and burning firewood, weaving through the narrow pathways lined with thatched huts. Women with babies strapped to their backs pounded millet in wooden mortars, while men returned from the fields, their laughter rising and falling like the rhythm of the drumbeats in the distance. Among them, in the shadow of a large baobab tree, sat Naima, her hands coated in slick clay. She worked in silence, shaping a pot with steady precision. Though young and striking, with deep brown eyes and high cheekbones, Naima was different from the other girls in the village. She had never spoken a word in her life. They called her Bubu the mute. No one wanted to marry a girl who could not speak. A woman was meant to sing at celebrations, whisper secrets to her husband, and call her children home when the sun dipped below the hills. But Naima's lips remained sealed, her voice trapped somewhere beyond reach. To many she was a burden, to others she was a bad omen. Yet, what the villagers failed to see was the magic in her hands. Naima's pottery was unlike anything anyone had ever crafted. Her fingers molded clay as if she spoke through them, each curve and pattern telling a story only she understood. Her pots were not just vessels for storing water or grain. They held something deeper, something that made people uneasy. Some swore that if you stared long enough at her finished work, you could see images take shape, scenes of things yet to happen. But whenever whispers of such mysteries spread, they were quickly drowned out by louder voices. She is just a girl who plays with mud. What good is beauty if she cannot even utter a word? A wife must speak, must sing, must serve. Who would take a woman who cannot even call her husband's name? The words stung, but Naima had long since learned to swallow the pain. Instead, she let her hands speak for her, shaping clay into smooth, elegant forms that even the village elders grudgingly admitted were unmatched. Still no suitor came. Her mother, Asha, worried endlessly. "Perhaps if we visit the medicine man," she suggested one evening, her voice low with desperation. "Maybe he can give you something to bring back your voice." Naima only shook her head, dipping her fingers back into the wet earth. She did not need a voice. What she needed was for people to listen. But Mji wa Udongo was not a village that listened easily. Then one fateful evening everything changed. The chief's son, Jabari, fell ill. Strong and proud, he had been the envy of every young warrior, the dream of every maiden. But now he lay burning with fever, his breaths shallow, his body trembling like dry leaves before a storm. The best healers in the village tried their remedies, herbs, chants, sacred waters, but nothing worked. His mother wept. His father, the great chief Mweni, stood helpless as his only son faded before his eyes. And then, as if guided by unseen hands, Naima shaped something new from the clay. A small sculpture, delicate and intricate. Jabari, lying beneath the old fig tree by the river, with a single flower resting on his chest. A white flower that only bloomed when the moon was full. Silent message. Plea. Cure. Would they finally see what they had ignored for so long? Would they trust the hands of the girl they had shunned? The answer would change everything. The night air was thick with a scent of damp earth as Naima sat outside her family's hut, her bare feet pressed against the cool ground. Around her, the village had grown quieter, though the distant hum of a drumbeat still echoed from the communal fire pit. It was the same every evening. Men gathered to tell stories, women exchanged gossip, and children played until their mothers called them home. But no one ever called for Naima. She had learned long ago that silence was both a curse and a refuge. The first time she realized she was different, she was only 5. She had tried to speak, tried to force sound from her throat, but all that came was air. Other children had laughed, pointing at her as they ran to tell their parents. Naima is broken. She cannot talk. At first, her mother had wept, praying for a miracle. Her father, a respected potter himself, had tried to ignore the whispers, focusing instead on teaching Naima the craft that had sustained their family for generations. If she could not speak, he reasoned, at least she could work. And work she did. By the time she was 10, her hands shaped clay with more skill than most adults in the village. But no skill, no talent, could erase the reality of who she was in their eyes. A woman who could not speak could not call her husband's name. She could not soothe a crying child in the night. She could not raise her voice in song during the harvest festival. No matter how beautiful her work was, no matter how much people marveled at her craftsmanship, Naima remained unwanted. Her mother's voice broke through the quiet. "You should sleep, my child." Naima glanced up. Asha stood in the doorway, her face lined with worry. Her mother had once been the most desired woman in Udongo, a beauty with sharp wit and a laugh that made men forget their troubles. She had married Naima's father not for wealth but for love. But love, it seemed, was not enough to protect Naima from a life of solitude. Instead of going inside, Naima turned to the small clay sculpture beside her, the one she had just finished shaping. She traced her fingers over its details. Jabari's sleeping form, the fig tree, the delicate white flower resting on his chest. Her heart thudded against her ribs. This was different from her other pieces. This was not just art. It was a vision. Her mother followed her gaze. "What is this, Naima?" Naima held up the sculpture, letting the moonlight cast soft shadows over the tiny, lifelike figure. She then pointed toward the river, where the great fig tree stood, its roots twisting into the earth like the fingers of an ancient spirit. Her mother's breath caught. "Are you saying something is there?" Naima nodded. Asha hesitated. She had always believed in the old ways, in omens and signs. Some said Naima's silence was a punishment from the spirits, but Asha had always believed it was something else, a gift they did not yet understand. And now, looking at the sculpture, she felt a chill run down her spine. "We must go to the chief," she whispered. Naima shook her head. The village did not trust what they could not explain. They had shunned her for years. Why would they listen now? But Asha grabbed her daughter's hands, squeezing them tightly. "If there is even the smallest chance that you know how to save him, we must try." The chief's hut was the largest in the village, its roof made of thick thatch, its entrance adorned with carved wooden masks representing the spirits of their ancestors. The air inside smelled of burning herbs and sweat, thick with the sounds of quiet murmurs. Jabari lay on a mat of woven reeds, his skin slick with fever, his chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. His mother knelt beside him, whispering prayers, while Chief Mweni stood like a stone pillar, his face carved with worry. Asha stepped forward, her voice steady but urgent. "My daughter has seen something." Mweni's sharp eyes flickered toward Naima. His expression darkened. "The mute girl." Naima flinched, but she did not lower her gaze. She simply lifted the sculpture in her hands, letting the firelight illuminate its delicate form. The chief frowned. "What is this?" Asha answered for her. "She is showing us the way. The fig tree by the river. The white flower." He paused. "She believes it will save him." A scoff came from one of the elders. "And we are to trust her visions." Another muttered. "A woman who cannot even speak. What does she know of medicine?" Mweni raised a hand, silencing them. He studied Naima for a long moment, then turned to his son's weak form. His jaw tightened. "The moon is full tonight," he said at last. "Send someone to find this flower." A hush fell over the hut. No one expected the chief to listen. No one believed the mute girl had anything to offer. But as warriors hurried into the night, as Naima stood beneath the weight of their stares, she knew this was only the beginning. Tomorrow everything would change. The warriors returned at dawn, their footsteps heavy with exhaustion. The village had not slept, waiting anxiously for their return. When they finally arrived, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. Naima stood among the gathering crowd, her hands clenched at her sides. Her mother was beside her, shoulders tense. Had they found the flower? Had they even tried? Or had they dismissed her silent warning as foolishness? Django, the chief's most trusted warrior, stepped forward, holding something wrapped in a cloth. His expression was unreadable as he unfolded the fabric, revealing a delicate white bloom. Its petals untouched, its scent sweet even from a distance. A murmur spread through the crowd. They had found it. Chief Mweni moved with the weight of a man who had spent the night in battle with his own fears. He took the flower and turned to the village healer, an elderly woman named Mama Oyana. The healer studied the delicate petals, pressing them between her fingers before nodding solemnly. "This is the moonflower," she said. "It is rare, and its healing properties are powerful. But it must be brewed before the sun is fully risen, or it will lose its strength." Jabari, still burning with fever, lay motionless in his father's hut. His breathing was shallow, his once strong frame now weak and frail. Without hesitation, Mama Oyana crushed the petals and mixed them into a warm broth, whispering ancient words of healing as she worked. Naima watched in silence, her heart pounding. She had seen it in her vision. The flower had come from her hands first, shaped in clay before it was found in the world. But would it be enough? The villagers waited, their doubt thick in the air. Some still whispered, still glanced at Naima as if she were a mystery they could not solve, or did not want to. Time passed. The sun rose higher. The chief's hut remained sealed, the only sign of life the occasional hushed movement inside. Then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, the door of the hut creaked open. Mama Oyana stepped out, her old eyes wide with something rare, hope. "The fever has broken," she announced. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by an eruption of voices. Jubilation. Disbelief. The chief himself emerged moments later, his face unreadable. But when he turned his gaze toward Naima, something had changed. Respect. For the first time in her life, people were not looking at her with pity or ridicule. They were looking at her as if she mattered. But just as quickly as the moment came, it was shattered. A shrill voice rang out from the crowd. "This is witchcraft." All eyes turned to the speaker, Nia, a woman known for her sharp tongue and sharper suspicions. She stepped forward, pointing directly at Naima. "This girl has no voice, yet she speaks through her hands. How did she know where to find the flower? How did she see what no one else could?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the villagers. The excitement of Jabari's recovery was still fresh, but so was the fear of the unknown. Naima's heart pounded. She had expected doubt, but not like this. Not so soon. "She did not cure Jabari," Mama Oyana said firmly. "The moonflower did." "And how did she know about it?" Nia challenged. "How do we know she didn't send the sickness in the first place, just so she could be the one to take it away?" Naima's stomach clenched. That was how fear worked. It did not need proof. It only needed a voice. Chief Mweni's face darkened. "Enough." His voice carried the weight of command. "Jabari lives because of her guidance. That is what matters." But the unease in the crowd did not disappear. The whispers did not stop. Naima could feel it, doubt curling around her like smoke, thick and suffocating. Her mother gripped her arm. "We should go home." Naima did not argue. She had seen enough. The morning had started with hope. But now, a seed of something far more dangerous had been planted, and she had no idea what it would grow into. Naima barely stepped inside her family's hut before her mother bolted the door behind them. The wooden latch felt flimsy against the weight of the fear pressing in from outside. Her mother turned, her eyes clouded with worry. "They are afraid," she signed with sharp, deliberate movements. "Fear makes people dangerous." Naima understood. The village had long whispered about her silence, turning her quiet existence into something unnatural, something to be feared. But now, after witnessing what her pottery could do, their unease had turned into something worse, suspicion. She sank onto the woven mat near the fire, staring at her hands. The same hands that had shaped the vision of the moonflower. The same hands that had, in a way, saved Jabari's life. Yet they also might be the hands that condemned her. Outside, the village was alive with murmurs, voices clashing between awe and doubt. Naima could feel the tension even through the thick walls of their hut. And then a knock. Hard. Urgent. Her mother stiffened. Naima swallowed hard as her mother unlatched the door. It was Amani. The chief's wife stood in the doorway, her regal posture intact, though her eyes betrayed a storm within. "May I enter?" Naima's mother hesitated before stepping aside. Amani moved inside gracefully, but there was no softness in her expression. She studied Naima in a way that made her skin prickle. Finally, she sighed and lowered herself to sit across from them. "My son is alive because of you," she said, her voice carefully measured. "For that, I am grateful." Naima nodded, unsure what else to do. "But gratitude does not erase fear," Amani continued. "You see what others cannot. That is a gift, but also a danger." Her words hung heavy in the air. "If the people turn against you," she said, "not even the chief will be able to protect you." Naima's mother flinched. "She has done nothing wrong," she signed fiercely. Amani's gaze softened, but only slightly. "Does not matter. Some already whisper of curses. Others wonder why Jabari fell ill in the first place." The accusation sat between them like a fire burning too close. Amani stood, adjusting her robes. "I came to warn you," she said. "Be careful, Naima. Your gift may have saved a life today. But tomorrow it might cost you everything." And with that she was gone. The door shut. The air in the hut felt thinner. Naima stared into the dying embers of the fire, her heart heavy. Gift. Curse. She was no longer just the mute girl no one wanted to marry. Now she was something far more dangerous. The days that followed were tense. The village that had once ignored Naima now watched her every move. Children whispered behind their mothers' skirts, elders exchanged cautious glances, and the young men, who once scoffed at the idea of marrying a silent girl, now kept their distance, as if even her shadow could bring misfortune. Naima tried to keep to herself, shaping her clay in the solitude of her family's hut, but the silence outside was different now. It wasn't the usual indifference. It was fear, stretched tight like an overfilled water gourd, ready to burst. One evening, as she gathered clay by the riverbank, she heard hushed voices approaching. She turned to see a group of women standing a short distance away. Their faces were tight with uncertainty. She saw what would happen to the chief's son. One woman whispered, "What else does she see?" Another scoffed, "Maybe she caused it. Maybe her hands don't just shape clay, they shape fate." Naima's heart pounded. They thought she had something to do with Jabari's illness. She shook her head, lifting her hands in protest, but the women flinched as if even that was dangerous. That night when she returned home, her mother was waiting at the doorway, her face pale with worry. "We must leave," she signed urgently. "They are afraid, Naima. And when people are afraid, they find someone to blame." Naima's stomach twisted. Leave. This was her home. Her clay. Her river. Everything she had ever known. But before she could respond, a sharp cry rang through the village. "The chief's son," someone yelled. "He is sick again." Naima froze. This time, there had been no vision in her pottery, no warning carved into clay. Yet the fear in the air thickened, and she knew with a sinking certainty that this time they would not just whisper about her. They would come for her. Her mother gripped her arm. "Naima, run." The fire-lit torches in the distance grew brighter, the voices angrier. Naima knew this was the moment that would decide everything. She had to prove them wrong. Or she had to disappear before they proved themselves right. Naima's pulse pounded in her ears as she stood frozen at the entrance of her hut. The angry voices outside grew louder, torches flickering like restless spirits against the night. Shadows danced along the walls, stretching toward her like accusing fingers. Her mother tightened her grip on Naima's arm. "Run," her eyes pleaded. But Naima didn't move. If she fled, the rumors would never end. They would say she was guilty. They would say she had cursed Jabari, that her hands didn't shape clay but calamity. A sharp voice cut through the commotion. "Bring her out." It was Chief Bakery. His usually calm voice was edged with something dangerous, something that sent a shiver through Naeema's spine. She stepped forward before anyone could drag her. Her mother's hand fell away, trembling. The villagers parted as she walked into the firelight. Faces that had once ignored her now burned with suspicion. Mothers clutched their children. Men clenched their fists. Chief Bakery stood tall in the center of the crowd, his dark robe billowing in the breeze. Beside him, Jabari lay limp on a makeshift cot, his skin slick with sweat, his breathing shallow. The chief's eyes met Naeema's. "You saw this," he said, voice like steel. "You knew my son would fall ill before it happened." Naeema swallowed hard, shaking her head. "I only shape what I see," she signed. The villagers murmured. A few laughed bitterly. "She doesn't even speak, and yet she expects us to believe she sees the future. She must have bewitched the clay. She's been rejected too many times. Maybe she wanted revenge." The words struck her like blows, but she refused to cower. Instead, she turned to the chief and took a deep breath. Slowly, she pointed to the hut where her sculptures were kept. "I will prove it," her mother translated. "Let her show you." The chief hesitated, then nodded once. Two warriors followed Naeema into the hut, their hands resting on their spears. Her pottery sat in neat rows along the walls, each piece a silent echo of her visions. She reached for the most recent one, the bowl she had made before Jabari fell ill. She turned it in her hands, letting the firelight illuminate the patterns carved into the clay. A boy with dark eyes, lying weak under a tree. A healer grinding herbs. A liquid being poured over cracked lips. The warriors exchanged wary glances. She carried the bowl outside, holding it up for all to see. "This is the vision she saw," her mother announced. Before the chief's son fell ill. The crowd stilled. The carving was too detailed, too precise to be mere coincidence. Chief Bakery's expression darkened. "And if you truly saw the illness," he said, stepping closer, "then tell me this, girl. Does your clay also show the cure?" Naeema's fingers clenched around the bowl. The answer was there, in the lines and grooves she had traced with her own hands. The healer, the herbs, the cure had been in front of them all along. Her heart hammered as she pointed at the bowl and then to the forest. "She says the medicine is there," her mother translated breathlessly. "A healer must prepare it." The villagers hesitated. And then the chief's gaze hardened. "If she is wrong," he said, "she will answer for it." The weight of those words pressed against her chest like stone. Naeema nodded. There was no turning back now. The crowd held its breath as the chief's warriors vanished into the dark forest, following Naeema's silent instructions. The air was thick with tension, and the only sound was the labored breathing of Jabari, the chief's son. Every passing moment felt like an eternity. Naeema stood motionless, her heart pounding. If she was wrong, if her visions had led them astray, there would be no saving her. The villagers had already turned on her once. They would not hesitate to cast her out or worse. The chief paced near his son's cot, his face unreadable. "If the girl speaks true, the gods have shown her favor," he muttered. If not, he let the words hang, unfinished but heavy with meaning. A sharp rustling in the trees made everyone turn. The warriors had returned, their arms filled with leaves, roots, and vials of crushed herbs. Behind them, the village healer, an elder woman with silver-threaded hair, stepped forward, inspecting the plants with a critical eye. "These are indeed the right ingredients," she murmured, her gaze flickering to Naeema in quiet astonishment. Without hesitation, she began grinding the herbs, mixing them with water and other remedies. The villagers watched in hushed anticipation as she knelt beside Jabari, carefully tilting his head back to pour the potion between his parched lips. Minutes passed. The fire crackled. Muffled prayers rippled through the crowd. Then a gasp. Jabari stirred. His eyelids fluttered before slowly opening. His shallow breaths deepened. The fever that had gripped him for days seemed to ease, and color returned to his face. A collective murmur spread through the crowd. Relief. Awe. Fear. The chief knelt beside his son, his hands trembling as he touched his forehead. "Jabari," he whispered. The boy blinked, then rasped, "Father." A stunned silence fell over the village. And then, as if breaking a spell, voices erupted. Some cheered, others wept, but all turned to Naima, the girl they had ridiculed, the girl they had rejected. Chief Bakery slowly rose to his feet. He studied Naima for a long moment before speaking, his voice firm and reverent. "This girl is not cursed." His gaze swept over the crowd. "She is blessed." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the villagers, their shame evident in their downcast eyes. The same people who once scorned her now looked upon her with awe. But Naima wasn't thinking about their praise or their regret. She was only thinking of one thing: how, for the first time in her life, her silence had spoken louder than words. For the first time in Naima's life, the village looked at her not with pity or scorn, but with reverence. As the chief's son slowly regained his strength, the once whispered insults about her muteness were replaced by murmurs of gratitude and admiration. That night, the village gathered around the great fire, a celebration held in her honor. The aroma of roasted goat and sweet yams filled the air, and the rhythmic beat of drums echoed across the open sky. Women clapped their hands as men stomped their feet in an energetic dance, their movements vibrant with joy. But Naima sat quietly at the edge of the crowd, watching, taking it all in. Chief Bakery approached her, his face no longer stern but open, searching. He lowered himself to sit beside her, something no one of his status had ever done before. "You have saved my son," he said, his voice rich with gratitude. "And you have shown us all that wisdom does not always need words to be heard." Naima bowed her head humbly, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the clay cup in her lap. The chief studied her for a moment before speaking again. "In all my years I have never seen such talent as yours. Not just your visions but your hands, your work. Your pottery tells stories. And now it has saved a life." She glanced at him, surprised. He continued, "The people must see what you can do. They must understand that you are not someone to pity but someone to honor." He stood then, turning to the crowd, raising his hands for silence. The dancing slowed, and all eyes turned toward him. "We have wronged this girl," he announced. "We have judged her unfairly, mocked her for what she could not do, instead of honoring what she could. But no more." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the villagers. Some lowered their heads in shame. Others nodded solemnly. "To right this wrong, Naima shall be given the highest honor," the chief continued. "She will be named the Keeper of Visions, the village's guide in times of uncertainty." Gasps of surprise filled the air. The title was one of deep respect, usually reserved for elders with decades of wisdom. Never had it been given to someone so young. Naima's heart pounded. She had always been an outcast, unseen, unheard. Now the entire village looked to her, not with disdain, but with expectation, with hope. As the celebration resumed, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Jabari, standing weakly but smiling. He pressed his palm to his chest in a silent gesture of gratitude. She smiled in return, warmth spreading through her. Her life had changed. Not because she had fought for their acceptance. Not because she had pleaded for their kindness. But because she had stayed true to herself, and in the end that had been enough. For the first time in her life she belonged. In the weeks that followed, Naima's life transformed in ways she had never imagined. Villagers who once whispered cruel words about her now came to her for guidance, eager to see what her pottery might reveal. Mothers brought their children, hoping for a glimpse of the future. Farmers sought her wisdom before planting their crops. Even the elders, once so dismissive, now sat at her feet, listening without expecting words. Despite the newfound respect, Naima remained the same, silent but full of expression. She worked at her pottery with the same quiet dedication, her hands shaping not just clay, but the destiny of the village itself. One afternoon, as she finished a delicate sculpture of two entwined birds, she felt a familiar presence beside her. Jabari, now fully healed, stood watching her work. His eyes held no pity, only admiration. "You see things the rest of us cannot," he said softly. "Not just in your pottery, but in people, in the world." Naima dipped her fingers into the water bowl, smoothing the sculpture's wings. She glanced up at him, questioning. He smiled. "I was blind to it before. We all were. But now I see clearly." There was something in his voice, something that made her heartbeat quicken. But he said nothing more, only reaching out to touch the sculpture she had made. Their fingers brushed for a brief moment before he turned and walked away, leaving her with a quiet promise of something more. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Naima looked at the village she had once longed to escape. It was still the same clay huts, the same dusty roads, but everything had changed. She had found her place, not because she had changed for others, but because she had stayed true to herself. And in doing so, she had shaped not only clay, but her own future. With a deep breath, she picked up a fresh lump of clay and began to mold. There was still more to create, more to see. And this time the whole world was ready to listen.